Hello, I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. On this episode, the Urban Agenda focus is on volunteerism. We'll meet one of the nation's leading advocates for the evolving role of volunteers in 21st century urban America. But first, we learn about a pioneering volunteer program founded by the Community Service Society 35 years ago, and now in place nationally with more than 500,000 volunteers. Here's the story of one volunteer's efforts being felt at a Head Start program in the Bronx. Our report is from Urban Agenda correspondent Josephine.
As a volunteer, I feel like it's myself giving something back to someone else, to another child. It's very rewarding.
73-year-old Gloria Smiley is a familiar face at this Head Start Center in the Bronx. For the past 7 years, she has volunteered her time caring for the preschoolers in daycare. What would you say is your greatest reward for the past 7 years?
Just coming, being with the children, with the staff, that we have a good rapport, going on trips, or just participating in every activity that is at the Head Start.
Gloria was assigned to this Head Start Center by the Retired Senior Volunteer Program known simply as RSVP. Founded on Staten Island in 1966, the program now places retired volunteers who are called grandfriends in 41 countries. Gloria is one of 500,000 grandfriends in the United States alone.
Through one of my friends, she introduced me to the program, and I like the idea of becoming a grandfriend.
When RSVP interviews the parents for the grandfriends, they're asked where they would like to volunteer at, where they're comfortable at, which is great because then if they're comfortable working with young children, they know what to kind of expect. They get training, they get workshops, and I keep them updated with, I meet with them and talk with teachers, and they plan in the classroom. So we don't choose them, they choose us. We wish there was more participation, getting more grandfriends and funds for programs like RSVP. It's been an enhancement, it's been a pleasure and a great experience for me.
Tell me the important and crucial role that the Grandfriends program plays.
I feel that a lot of children don't have grandparents, don't have that experience with an elderly person, and that an elderly person has a lot to give. Just because they're elderly and whatever, but they're still physically active and have a lot to give back to the community.
Ms. Smiley's a great, loving, caring person who the kids love and the staff love having her around. She helps the kids with the computer in the block area. She reads stories to them. She makes them feel good. And I think that's great because they need each other. The kids need her, and she needs them too. When she's not here, they say, where's Miss Smiley? And when Miss Smiley comes in, they run to her. Miss Smiley, and they're after her in the classroom, what you doing? Because they want to be with her, to do it with her.
Tell me how much you like Mrs. Smiley. What do you love about her?
Like this.
Oh, you love her like this?
Yes.
Oh.
It's rewarding for me to get up every morning just to come here and be with the children, to help them.
What greater thing is this for someone to give back to our society than volunteer and give back all this knowledge and life experiences where you can't put a price on it. And I really support it, and I hope others do also.
Volunteers like Gloria Smiley have a deep sense of appreciation and respect for their work, and that is in essence what volunteerism is all about. For the CSS Urban Agenda, I'm Josephine.
Joining me now is Susan Ellis, president of her own company, Energize, Inc., a training, consulting, and publishing firm specializing in volunteerism. She is the author of 10 books, including From the Top Down, The Executive Role in Volunteer Program Success. Susan, thank you very much for joining us today.
I'm pleased to be here, David.
Well, I think all of us have sort of our mindset of sort of the Little House on the Prairie volunteerism of perhaps a generation ago. Is the volunteer changing in the 21st century?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, actually, even at the Little House on the Prairie, we always didn't pay attention to everything we saw going on.
Right.
So that's a great example. The opening segment, which is a lovely segment, is a wonderful example of some of the more traditional kinds of volunteering going on, but listeners ought to be aware of how incredibly broad the volunteer field is. First of all, the common thought is that it's sort of, you'll excuse me, a little old lady in a flowered hat and tennis shoes.
Right.
But the truth of the matter is that everybody does volunteering. Volunteers come in all shapes, sizes, ages, colors, backgrounds, nationalities, and often it's a labeling problem. We don't label it as volunteering.
Well, one of the things that concerns us, obviously, in the not-for-profit sector, I think certain conservative elements in the country have asserted that volunteerism can take over from government responsibility. How do volunteers fit? Where do they fit appropriately?
Well, you know, it's really funny. I've said for a long time that being in the volunteer field is in the eye of the beholder. We're either motherhood and apple pie or we're revolution. Right. The fact of the matter is that volunteers are never a substitute for adequate funds, but you can't do it just with money. So it's really an approach of money and volunteer help. You see, the issue is that when we in a democracy talk about a participatory democracy, we're talking about people putting themselves where their beliefs are. And there's a code word going on right now talking about civil society. Mm-hmm. Civil society, which has to do with whether we take ownership and have concerns about the neighborhoods in which we live and the broader community. Volunteering is one of the real examples of something that's been going on for a long time and in some ways is thought of as old-fashioned. But when you change the words, for example, a lot of people know what activism is, but they don't connect it to volunteering. I often get groups going when I say, tell me what Paul Revere did to earn a living. And the fact of the matter is he was a silversmith, and he was a very good silversmith, so we know that. But that isn't really why we remember him. We know him for his volunteer work. And all of that stuff, you know, who threw the tea in Boston Harbor? Well, they weren't paid to do that, right? And people sometimes get real miffed. Well, that's activism, that's not volunteering. And somehow the idea that volunteering is just helping out. That's where this mythology about we can cut budgets and we can put volunteers in comes from because of that word. On the other hand, when you look at the fact that, for example, men have always volunteered. They just called themselves coaches, trustees, and firemen. Right. And so this whole idea of people serving on boards, of doctors, lawyers, and accountants do pro bono, publico work. And the business community often doesn't do volunteering. They call it donated professional services. Mm-hmm. Suddenly, when you expand the thinking to all of those many kinds of things, we begin to see how much of American life, and in urban settings absolutely, is based on having citizens participate in the things they care about.
Yeah, it's clearly, when I was growing up in Black Brooklyn and Bedford-Stuyvesant, the Black church was the center of volunteer activity. But it was also the center for political life. I mean, the block captains, the PTAs, the block associations, all of those things were the center of the first movement of black political life, and it was a volunteer-based system.
Well, absolutely, and that's another one of those mythologies that somehow volunteering is white. The fact is, again, that's a vocabulary issue. Sometimes the word volunteer can repel as frequently as it can attract.
Well, we certainly found that when I came to the Community Service Society more than 14 years ago. RSVP, the Retired Senior Volunteer Program that was mentioned in the piece, was a thriving program, but it created a real problem for us in the sense that the volunteers were focused in Staten Island and in Queens exclusively. They were non-minority, and yet increasingly the agency was trying to address the problems of the very poor of the city of New York, and there was a mismatch. And I remember being told by some of the staff, well, that's just the way it is. Volunteers don't come in poor neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. They have too many life crises. And I had a mini fit because, again, I remembered the Black church. I remembered what the people who ran the block associations in Central Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant had done. And we made a conscious effort that today has shifted the number of volunteers until we have a majority of African American and Latino and Asian volunteers. And it allows us, obviously, to do interesting things. It allows the Staten Island program to serve the vital needs and pressing needs in Staten Island, but it also allows us to go into the South Bronx and provide work for, Head Start kids.
Absolutely. And I suspect that calling it Grand Friends has more appeal than calling it Be a Volunteer. It's interesting, Big Brothers Big Sisters of America put out a report and a booklet for their affiliates about minority recruitment, and it's called Pass It On, because what they discovered is that if you say, well, here's a chance for you to pass it on, that terminology actually meant more. Help out, be a part of. We don't have to be labeling everything. And the other thing is that right now, Robert Putnam has a lot of currency, you know, bowling alone,
Right.
that the demise of Western civilization is occurring because people aren't in bowling leagues anymore. Now, of course, this is true, that joining something with membership dues and being a member for a year or longer is not where life is at today, and I don't disagree with the findings. However, what's really interesting is that at exactly the same time Putnam did the study, John McKnight in Chicago was studying the housing projects of Chicago, and he discovered hundreds of very informal organizations, networks, babysitting cooperatives, shopping, how they helped seniors with getting their chores done or whatever. And he concluded that actually the idea of association and people helping one another, which is the basic essence of volunteering, was very much alive and well.
You know, sometimes we're talking obviously towards the volunteerism of adults. What about the issue of volunteerism for the young? I have become, people have stopped talking to me in some cases. Have obviously pushed the notion that there should be almost mandatory as part of graduation from high school.
Well, it's
volunteer.
Not almost. And many, many communities today are in fact putting in a requirement. Pennsylvania has a state requirement for a number of hours of community service for high school graduation.
Right.
I should add that it's not new, because the parochial schools, Catholic schools, Quaker schools, still do it. Right. It's absolutely a long-term commitment to the idea of service. But the thing about young people and volunteering that's so interesting is, I always say, volunteering allows a young person to rise to the level of their competency, not their pay rate. If you're really a bright and active and interested young person, you can do things as a volunteer that no one would hire you to do, but you get the experience and you get and the biggest one is, how many young people are the computer experts in agencies all over the country? I mean, that's who you turn to. You want to know what's new on the internet? You don't go to somebody who's 50.
Right.
You go to that 12-year-old.
We had that experience. My wife's a clinical psychologist and suddenly decided she wanted to focus on creating a web page and was buying books, and then we called our son up at college, and he immediately faxed her instructions.
Absolutely.
As to how to do this, and we're still trying to figure out
and
the
had she already been online, he would have emailed her the instructions,
yes.
which actually reminds me.
Oh, that's true. You meant, yeah.
That's right. That there is a whole new. We are living in a world in which there's an entirely brand new form of service, which is called virtual volunteering. Now, the volunteers are real, but the service, volunteers aren't virtual. It's online service, and I do need to tell you that it's expanding and it's quite fascinating. And it includes people that do all kinds of research projects or translate something or write a press release or edit material via email exchanges with agencies, and they can be anywhere in the world. But the one that's really exciting is online mentoring, becoming a very, very big thing, where adults work with kids on computer to help them with homework and all of that. Very exciting. The San Jose Musical Children's Theater wrote a play online with children with disabilities. They were all over the country, and together they created a play which was put on by children in San Jose and then shown on the internet.
This raises an interesting question. I've gotten somewhat concerned of the isolation in some respects of New York City in terms of innovation. Is innovation going on around the rest of the country, sort of feeding back and forth all through the rest of the country?
Oh, well, I think, first of all, the truth of the matter is that the internet is a two-edged sword. We all know that there are things negative about it. But what it's done is it's allowed like-minded creative people to find one another. And there is absolutely no question that the potential for sharing is quite enormous. And that, as I said, the San Jose Musical Children's Theater could never have reached out to young people anywhere in the country to help them write a play before this. And now people can watch what they did and can, in fact, I'll tell you interesting, the Wall Street Journal reported 20 years ago on, no, it wasn't quite 20 years ago, but it was really long ago because I remember having it and being really wondering about it, where there was a program here in the city where frail homebound elderly were taught how to use early email. And they began visiting with one another at night when they couldn't sleep. And when you think about baby boomers retiring at a point where they will have spent years online,
right,
the idea of friendly visiting is going to change really dramatically. And, you know, we're going to begin to get to see one another on the internet, too. So there's some interesting possibilities there.
Well, let's talk from the other vantage point. You know, we've talked about what the volunteers can do. Not-for-profits, others who want to recruit volunteers, what are the mechanisms, particularly for smaller not-for-profits?
Right.
What should they expect of volunteers? What should they be expected to do for volunteers?
Well, you know, David, it's interesting, even the way you frame the question, if they want to recruit volunteers. I would like, if nothing else comes across to your viewers, I would love them to realize that that's the wrong question.
Okay.
Well, because, not that they don't want to recruit, but many organizations recruit before they're ready. I honestly believe that people will come forward to volunteer. You have to spread the message. You can't sit at home and pray that they'll come. That's the God will provide school of volunteer management. But the idea that if you have something really meaningful for people to do, and that requires planning and some infrastructure, I would say the biggest problem we have in the volunteer field today is underutilization of volunteers. It's wonderful to say how good it feels and all of that, but I would really believe that a lot of listeners have had the experience of offering their services and it not being utilized well, or of being bored at a volunteer assignment, or coming and finding too many people were recruited on a day and they weren't really needed. That's tragic. That's really wasting effort.
Yes.
Organizations need to go from being thought less about volunteers to being thoughtful about volunteers. We plan if we're going to put in a new computer system. We plan if we're going to run a big new fundraiser. We ought to do some planning about volunteers. Because you see, tension can occur between volunteers and paid staff if you aren't careful. And because of a question you asked earlier, I mean, a lot of people think volunteers are brought in to save money. Well, very few organizations are saving money, putting it in the bank because they have volunteers. The better way to say it is, volunteers are generally brought in so that the agency can spend every penny it has and then do more. And there are unique things that volunteers offer. You know, volunteers have more credibility than paid staff does. And it's not a matter of truth. It's not like paid people lie and volunteers always tell the truth. But if I say to you, I'm the PR director of CSS, what am I going to tell you about CSS? Wonderful, thanks, I'm a good PR director. But if I say, I've been volunteering with that agency and I want to tell you why they're worth my time, that's pretty powerful. So I think the bottom line is that agencies ought to think about it.
I want to reinforce this. We've obviously, through our program, have an evolving understanding of some of these things, but particularly your issue in terms of credibility. We began a very sophisticated program dealing with informing Medicaid recipients of their rights in the new HMO environment, health maintenance organizations. It's a big transformation going on throughout the country for all sorts of people, but particularly for Medicaid. And we recruited, I use the term advisedly now, we began to solicit people who would educate Medicaid recipients about what they have to do as they go ahead. And they committed to enormous amounts of time in training. And it's interesting the kind of people who came out. There were many people who, young elderly, and who had taken the city buyout, municipal government buyout, who had been very senior people as administrators and the rest in a variety of social welfare programs, all sorts of things, who came out and went through this training and then put in enormous numbers of hours helping others understand the Medicaid system. And it dawned on us when I saw some of the training that if I had tried to hire somebody right out of college to instruct or tell a Medicaid recipient, mainly women between their ages of 30 and 40, who have seen more of life than a lot of people. They've done all sorts of things. They've sustained their families through some tough time. My young senior was 10 times more credible than any person who couldn't have that kind of experience. And so there is a power that you couldn't buy. Literally, there's no way to get a credible. This is people talking about very personal things for them. A child who's sick,
a staff member, there's always this thing of, well, I'm just a case to you.
Right.
You know, you have to be nice to me. And again, it's a bad rap because really the paid staff member might care a great deal. But there is this feeling. I do want to say, I'm not against you recruiting, and I want to be my feeling, though, is that your ability to recruit this kind of high-powered person you just talked about, the ability to recruit is directly connected to what you ask people to do.
Yes.
And one of the mistakes we do is we dumb down the volunteer assignment. We say, oh, people don't want to volunteer today, so we'll make this easy, we'll make this innocuous, it won't have a whole lot of impact. And what happens? It's not appealing.
Right.
And what do you get? You get the kind of person who doesn't want to do very much. But if you say this, you know, the challenge, the idea of a challenge, what would you rather spend your free time on? And it's important to realize that the challenge here is not take a paid job or volunteer. That's never the challenge. It's I only have a little bit of free time in my life. I'm a busy person. I want to play in my free time. Now, if I'm going to give up my discretionary time, it better be something that matters to me, which actually is another thing that's happening today. Busy people double things up. If volunteering can be fun as well as have an impact, well, then that's even more worth it to do for your free time. So what we're seeing is a lot of group projects. Bucks County, Pennsylvania has something called Single Volunteers of Bucks County, because what they've discovered is that volunteering is safer than a singles bar, and that it's a nice way to meet people that care about what you care about. And that's a wonderful meshing of today's concerns, which is many more people being single multiple times in their life, but they want to do service, but they want to do it at the same time. National Ski Patrol will tell you that the reason they recruit volunteers is how many people love to ski. They can be on patrol and feel smug about how much they ski. Now that's a wonderful meeting, win-win-win situation.
Not to mention dating, as my son is showing me.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes. I think just again, we have an example of that, obviously. We began essentially team volunteering at one of the lower performing elementary schools in the South Bronx, where we bring in a team of 20 all the way to 30 seniors, put them through training on how to teach reading to kids in 2nd and 3rd grade. And what seemed to really trigger, again, along with the same notion, is the social interaction they were getting. First of all, they were treated completely different by the school. They weren't one volunteer. They were a team of self-supporting volunteers. They had hours of work. They met in conference with teachers' groups, and it changed the whole environment, and it became a real, I think there's been a marriage out of it already, but it's become, we won the presidential award for this thing, but
the switchboard's going to light up when this is over.
This became a big social time for young seniors in their 50 through 60 and 70. But the excitement of dealing with children, but coming back and sort of reflecting with your peers who are doing the same work was enormously powerful. And we're trying to roll that notion out to some of the other engagements, because the isolation is not, to be sort of an outlier in an organization where you're the only volunteer.
Right, but it's also, you know, volunteering never exists in a vacuum. All of the things that affect human beings in our culture affect volunteers. So isolation, I mean, that sort of does not go hand in hand with the concept of an urban agenda. I mean, people live in crowded places but feel isolated. Volunteering is a way to get a sense of connection. I mean, it's really interesting how you can live in New York and sometimes feel like you hardly talk to anybody. This is something that volunteering can have a real impact on.
What can government do to encourage this process? I mean, we're seeing it sort of emerge. I sometimes get frustrated that I don't see it. It's sort of coming to scale, I think is what we call, as I'd like to. What do you think government intervention, where is it appropriate in this?
Well, actually, I think that there are mixed messages about this. I mean, on the one hand, volunteering is voluntary and the government is mandated, is statutory, so it's a little questionable. I think what's happening is government has a role to play in helping communication, in helping the interchange among organizations, and in funding director volunteer positions, because the problem is that it can't be volunteers without any funds at all. You need a coordinator. If you're going to have 3 people come in Monday and 2 come in when the moon is full and 1 who comes in on alternating Thursdays, you need somebody who's going to coordinate that, and that's a true job. And I think that that's a really important thing. The other thing I do want to point out, I don't want to lose this thought, is the value of volunteers is that everything that's important to us in our society was founded by volunteers. I absolutely guarantee you that CSS's first people who started it were volunteers. That's what the voluntary sector is. It's people who care about something make change. Here is a city in which the AIDS epidemic struck very seriously. 15 years ago, not one of these organizations existed. They began in people's living rooms, and now they're major organizations hiring people. You know, volunteers actually start jobs, they don't take them, because they show where the cutting edge concerns are. And I think that's one of the most powerful things. And in a way, government can't mandate that because they are not the ones who know where the cutting edge is.
It's, again, I'm going to be confirming from our own experience, our organization's 155 years old. And as I joke with people, I wasn't there at the beginning, though I feel like it some days. One of our founders was a woman named Josephine Lowell. For those of our viewers who remember the Civil War movie Glory, where black troops were fought in major battles in the Civil War, it was led by her brother. And basically she lost her brother and her husband in the war. And after the Civil War was over, she came down to New York and turned the whole field of how you help people in poverty on its head, single-handedly almost. She has a statue in Bryant Park. But she created what was called friendly visitors. And these were the first volunteers who went in and looked at conditions of poverty and helped people, but also went to government and said, this is intolerable because we're finding that people who own these slums are making huge amounts of money off the suffering of poor people. So it was volunteer-driven.
So maybe the biggest role government can play is to listen when volunteers point things out.
Absolutely.
And you know, you don't have to go back 155 years. Many people will remember that it's comparatively recently that we have women's shelters, that we have laws and all about child abuse. So, you know, it's just a really thing. And I do want to say, International Year of Volunteers, 2001, there's an opportunity to celebrate.
Thank you very much, Susan, for joining us on the Urban Agenda. Volunteerism is changing today, especially in urban America. Organizations and agencies addressing the challenges faced by underserved populations and people coping with poverty are especially in need of that help. I urge you to consider being a volunteer, making a contribution where you believe your skills and your spirit will find a place to contribute. If you would like to volunteer or who have questions about volunteering, please call us at 212-614-5555. I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. I hope you will join me next time for the Urban Agenda.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.